Okay, what's your name and
Yeah.
job?
Okay, my name is Larry Uhlman, and I'm a teacher of humanities and historically language arts. And I've been teaching for 20 years at Hale.
So, as a teacher, why did you let your students choose their own project?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And the first thing I want to say is, or just think about the language the question has, let my students choose. I think, I mean, I like the choice part a lot. I think it's interesting, and I'm not faulting you for the question, but just think about the language of letting my students, as if like I'm the one that gives permission or not to people to do anything, right? And I think that that's the kind of language we need to continue to work on changing. So I think choice helps change that kind of dynamic between a teacher and their students. But I think even the language of let needs to change. I think we need to create environments in which students are doing work that they're interested in. And then as teachers, we're there to assist uh, the students in learning how to do that work in the most meaningful ways as we've learned in our experience of doing meaningful work to do work. Does that make sense? And so if I can object to the let but agree to the choose, then I'm all on board with that. And the reason is when students choose work, they're more likely to be invested in the work. I think teachers underestimate the power of this, and I think we confuse specific content with learning how to learn. I think that there's all kinds of content that a student could be involved in that will help them learn how to learn, help them learn how to think, learn how to act. And I don't think we should be so hung up on thinking that the content has to be something narrow or specific. Yeah. And then just kind of an addendum to that, I think that where the racism comes in, the systemic racism, is that the content that has been selected historically is racist in the sense that it is singularly focused on a particular group's experience. And I think that really has to change. And I think choice helps change that as well.
Great. What have you done in the past like this, and how has that helped you with this?
That's a really good question, and I think if you gave me more time to think, I'd probably be able to come up with more things. There have been the thought that came to my mind when you first said that to me is there have been times where I have really given, from very early on in my experience. I think maybe first or second year, I remember a project with students where I said, "Here's a book that we're going to read, and you're going to construct your kind of calendar of what you're going to do on what day." And I handed them a blank calendar template, and I said, and I want you to show me some work related to this book on this date. Or maybe I even said, you can select within this sort of swath of time. And that group of students, I think the book was Their Eyes Were Watching God, and which is a book I still work with in 11th grade. And that work was some of the best work I ever remember students doing to this day. And they had like performances that they created. It was like a kind of almost a musical with like all these different parts. And I think maybe they even had the different groups sort of had figured out how to organize their performances such that even though they were created independently, they had connection somehow. Whether that's right or not, because my memory is a little hazy there, the feeling I had was the work was of very high quality. And it told me something as a young teacher that I didn't need to be always, orchestrating or directing something. Now, I've had these experiences over time with students, I would say, almost maybe early on as exceptions rather than the norm in my classroom. And I even had the experience of thinking like, I have to be honest, like I get afraid of that work. And I think teachers get afraid of that work. I think that we feel like we're doing what we're supposed to be doing when we're at the center of the room, kind of orchestrating things, describing what needs to be done, delivering the content that students need to absorb. And I think those are harmful models for education. but they're so ingrained that we feel anxious when they're not happening. And so I've had the experience over the years of being afraid to get back into this more student-centered approach because I worry about, I'm supposed to be this other kind of teacher. And then because enough time or a lot of time has elapsed between experiences of my classroom being more student-centered, that when I return to them, there's always this feeling then of like, oh, I love this. Like, why did I forget that this is the way to do class? I think what's changing for me is that I'm much more comfortable as a norm for it to be that way. And I also think that there is a intersection between what I think is good for any human being's intellectual development with what we need to do around inequities, whether they be racial inequities, financial, economic inequities, sexual orientation inequities. I mean, you can name all of them. I think there's an intersection between what's good for any human being's learning and what's good for equity in the world. So that when we give choice to students, when we give time for students to slowly figure out what they're interested in and work in those domains, that is both good for intellectual development, cognitive development, and it's good for equity. And so it's a win-win, right? Classic win-win.
Great. How do you think you've improved from past teachings of this subject?
I have a long way to go, but it's an exciting journey to be on, to feel like I am more frequently finding those places with students in my classroom. I don't know if I mentioned to your class yet, but I'm reading a book right now. I think it's incredibly important to always be reading. And by reading, I don't necessarily mean, physical book with words on it. I mean, that's one form of reading, but it could be having a conversation with people. It could be, investing yourself in a class, investing yourself in experience, traveling, going for a run. Those are, in a sense, those are all constantly. So one form that takes for me is reading books. And I'm reading a book right now called The Culture Code, and it emphasizes how important creating a sense of safety, the ability for people in a group to be vulnerable, and for the group to have a purpose. Those three things, safety, vulnerability, and purpose, lead to excellent results, both like in terms of if the group is a basketball team, victories, but also becoming much more important to me as a teacher than some content that I'm teaching. And I think I'm getting better at remembering that is what I want my classroom to be like most of the time. But you have to tell me ultimately if that's your experience of the class or not. Students, and that's part of what you've asked for collectively, student feedback to teachers. I agree with that, as long as it's respectful in the sense of like meaningful, useful feedback, not just, yes, we get pissed off with each other and say like, so-and-so is an asshole or this or that. That's normal to do that, but it's not helpful for anybody really, other than, letting off steam. So if it's meaningful feedback, yeah, I'm very interested in that, if we're on the same page.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thank